Clint Eastwood walked into his own restaurant unnoticed until he heard a waitress crying. What happened next left the whole room silent. The night was winding down in Carmel by the sea, the kind of town where faces were familiar and strangers rarely went unnoticed. The glow from the streetlights cast long shadows along the sidewalk, stretching toward the entrance of a modest but well-loved restaurant, Mission Ranch. A place with history, charm, and most importantly, Clint Eastwood's name above the door. But tonight there were no flashing cameras or hushed whispers about Hollywood royalty. No one expected him to be here. Clint Eastwood had always been a man who valued hard work and respect. At 94, he still carried himself with quiet authority, a presence that could shift the air in a room without a word. He hadn't planned on stopping by the restaurant tonight. It was an impulse, an old habit of checking in, seeing things as they were when no one knew he was watching. As he stepped inside, the familiar atmosphere wrapped around him, the soft clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, the low hum of a piano drifting from the corner, the scent of sizzling steak and fresh sourdough bread filled the air, blending with the faint saltiness of the ocean. Beyond the windows, the place was full, but not chaotic. Just the right level of energy for a late-evening crowd. He didn't make a show of his presence. No grand entrance, no clearing of throats or shifting glances, dressed in a well-worn jacket and dark slacks. He moved with an ease that let him disappear into the background, just another old-timer looking for a quiet seat. But then something stopped him cold, a sound soft but unmistakable. It wasn't the usual clatter of a busy restaurant, or the occasional raised voice of a lively guest. It was something far more out of place. A muffled sob. Clint's gaze sharpened. He turned his head slightly, following the sound, toward the far side of the dining area. Just beyond the swinging doors to the kitchen, tucked near the service station, half hidden by a partition, stood a young waitress. She had her back to the room, her hands gripping the counter. Her shoulders shook as she took deep, uneven breaths. Trying to pull herself together, she was crying. She wasn't making a scene. She wasn't asking for attention. In fact, she was trying desperately not to be noticed, but Clint had noticed. He stayed where he was for a moment, watching as she wiped her face quickly, inhaled sharply and straightened up. A mask of forced composure slipped into place. The kind of expression a person wears when they've swallowed their pride. Too many times something about it sat wrong with him. He wasn't the kind to pry into every little problem. Life had its share of troubles, and people handled them in their own way. The way she had shrunk into herself, the way her hands trembled just before she turned to re-enter the dining room, it wasn't just frustration, it was hurt. Clint shifted his weight slightly. Still unnoticed, he could have ignored it, taken a quiet seat in the back, let the night go on as usual. But that wasn't how he worked. His instincts told him there was more to this, and when Clint Eastwood got that feeling, he didn't just walk away, but before he could, he wasn't the only one who noticed. 2 employees, a busboy, and another waitress stood near the bar. Their conversation hushed but urgent. Clint wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but in a room like this, where voices blended into the ambient hum, certain words had a way of cutting through the noise. "That guy's been on her case all night," the young man muttered, shaking his head. "I know she's new too, just started last month," the other waitress whispered back. "It's disgusting and nobody's saying a damn thing." Clint's jaw tightened slightly. "Nobody's saying a damn thing." He shifted his gaze toward the dining room, scanning the tables who was responsible. The restaurant wasn't a fancy, white tablecloth kind of place. It had character, a rustic warmth that made people feel at home. But there were always a few customers who mistook good service for servitude. The kind who thought a tip gave them the right to demean the person bringing their food. And then Clint saw him, a middle-aged man, maybe late 50s, sat at a corner table, relaxed in his chair like he owned the place. His blazer was unbuttoned, his tie loosened, and his laughter cut through the air far louder than necessary. The people at his table, 2 men and a woman, seemed entertained, though not entirely comfortable. The woman glanced toward the kitchen doors, her expression unreadable. The waitress wasn't at their table anymore, but the way they carried on told Clint everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a bad tipper. This was a man who enjoyed making people uncomfortable, the kind Clint had spent a lifetime despising. His hand slid into his pockets as he turned back toward the kitchen. He didn't need to guess what had happened. He already knew the details would come soon enough. Right now, there was only one thing on his mind. That waitress was in the back crying, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let that stand. But before he made his move, he caught sight of the girl stepping back onto the floor, her shoulders squared, her face composed as if nothing had happened. Clint watched as the young waitress stepped back into the dining area, moving carefully like someone walking on broken glass. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable, but her eyes carried a weight no one should have to bear. During a shift, she wove through the tables, tray balanced on one arm, stopping just short of the loud man's table. Clint noticed how her posture stiffened, how she inhaled a deep breath like she was bracing for impact. The man didn't look at her at first. He was mid-conversation, waving a hand in the air as he exaggerated some story that had his companions half smiling, half enduring. But the moment he turned his head and saw her standing there, a slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Ah, look who's back," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. The woman at the table looked away. One of the men checked his watch, suddenly interested in the time. Clint saw it clearly now. The silent bystanders, the ones who heard every word but decided it was easier to pretend they hadn't. "You forget how to do your job, sweetheart," the man continued, taking a lazy sip of his drink. The waitress didn't flinch. She simply set a fresh glass of water in front of him. "There you go, sir," she said quietly. "Oh, so now you're polite?" He laughed, shaking his head, then turning to his friends. He said, "See, all it takes is a little coaching. You push them enough and they figure it out." The waitress gripped her tray a little tighter. Not a single person at the table told him to stop. Clint had seen a lot in his lifetime. Good men